Welcome to Improving Competency-Based Professional Development in Elementary Mathematics. I'm Anthony Dove. I'm sorry I can't present this to you live, but you're more than welcome to reach out to us, and you'll see our information at the end of this presentation. Now, we know that there's a challenge to provide appropriate professional development in rural areas. The geography of these areas spreads the teachers out tremendously, and there's so few because the schools are often smaller, it's hard to get them together because many of them will have to travel hours. On top of that, the cost of much professional development for many of these teachers is more than they can handle for their districts or themselves, where they're often expected to pick up the cost not only for fees and travel, but also for their substitute. And that's just not a feasible method for many of them. That's where online professional development is starting to provide new opportunities for teachers, especially in these rural areas. And that is the reason we created the Appalachian Support for Specialized Education Training, or ASSET. It's a $14.1 million grant funded by the U.S. Department of Education Seed Grant Foundation. And here we're creating competency-based professional development that's online and asynchronous. Our framework is that we focus on it being competency-based education, where they will get bite-sized chunks of material that they will show mastery and workforce skills that they can translate back into the classroom. We use the learning sciences to help us determine the best ways for teachers to learn, and we use our learning analytics to help us better meet the needs of teachers as we gather our data. And finally, we try to make use of simulated and gamified learning to help make the professional development engaging and help it focus on those competencies to show that mastery. In ASSET, we use micro-credentials. Each micro-credential is 10 hours of professional development. And what we say is you put a stack of these micro-credentials together, we'll give you a stack of 50 hours, which then can be used in many states that we've worked with so far for relicensure of their teachers for either 3 years or 5 years. Currently, we have 10 different micro-credentials in elementary mathematics, elementary literacy, and classroom management, and we have 5 more that should be live by the end of 2020. We do also plan to extend out to other forms of micro-credentials, but these are the ones that are currently in line. Now, part of the problem with the ASSET grant is that it is free to all Appalachian teachers. Now, that's a great thing, but what that also does is that in some areas, administrators are having their teachers take the professional development even if it's not intended for them as the learners. So you may have art teachers taking a micro-credential on mathematics, or maybe one on literacy. So there's this issue of like, how do we still meet the needs of this unintended audience when we're gearing our micro-credentials to a very specific group to help them improve their instruction in the classroom? Also, as we go forward, we're continuing to iterate and improve on our micro-credentials. And it's important to recognize, what is that impact? How did that impact those that previously took the version of a micro-credential to those that are taking it now? Are those improvements helping the learning process? So for this study, we focused on one specific micro-credential, our first one that we launched, which was the elementary mathematics making sense of word problems. For this study, we actually looked at the fact that of the unintended and the intended audience, as well as that iteration idea of version 1 and version 2 of this micro-credential. And we focused on looking at 5 different aspects within these groups. What's the likelihood of the groups to recommend taking micro-credentials from ASSET? How much time did it take them to complete this micro? What was their perceived difficulty of the micro-credential? What was their perceived learning from the micro-credential? And what were the differences between these 4 groups? And being able to look at these 5 different areas will help us better understand how this specific micro-credential impacted both the intended and unintended audiences, especially after a second iteration was released. So when we talk about the iteration, the first thing we did is we went through and fixed any errors we could find within the micro-credential. This could be grammar, typos, sentence structure. It could also be that some of the questions maybe were telling teachers that they were correct, but they were marked incorrect. So trying to fix any of those type of question errors as well to make sure that they were all accurate. We also went through and created downloadable notes pages that included additional materials, additional definitions of key terms that were used throughout the micro-credential, as well as additional space for the teachers to keep their own notes as they completed the micro-credential. Within 3 of the 4 modules, we also added more material to help bolster explanations, especially for those that weren't as familiar with some of the content in these micro-credentials, since they are only 10 hours at a time. So we added a section on visual representations and manipulatives and how they could be implemented in the classroom in the first module. Second module, we used the idea of cognitively guided instruction throughout, but we added afterwards a whole piece about what CGI is, what's the underlying outcomes, and additional resources for those that had never seen CGI before. And in the third module, we added a component with math anxiety, explaining what math anxiety is, as well as strategies that we can help mitigate math anxiety with our young students. And finally, we added a discussion forum at the end of the micro-credential to improve learner interaction with the other learners. That asks them how they plan to use what they've learned in their classroom, as well as respond to others about what they're reading. Now, we talked about 2 audiences. What we consider our intended audience for this specific micro-credential were K-5 general teachers, the special education teachers, and math specialists. These 3 groups are the groups that we often will market to, and they're the ones that we state that this was specifically for, to help improve instruction for those that may actually be teaching mathematics in the elementary classroom. However, we do have an unintended audience, which could be administrators. We would have middle school and secondary educators as well, both in math, but also in history and English and other subjects. We also had specials teachers from the whole K-12 gamut, which could be like your PE teachers, your music, and your art teachers, those types of teachers. And so when we look at that, in the first version, which lasted about the first 5 months of the micro, there were 73 intended audience members and 29 unintended audience, which is about 28% of those that completed the micro-credential. When we fixed it and then went through the next several months, the version 2 had 59 completed as the intended and 26 completed as the unintended audience, which is about 31% of the completers were of the unintended audience. For collecting our data, we looked at our 8-question survey that was asked at the end of the micro-credential when they completed, which includes 6 Likert questions and 2 open-ended questions. 4 of those 6 Likert questions are what we used for our survey question, or for our study here. We're doing a 2x2 ANOVA, and for those that were significant, we used Tukey's HSD comparisons to help us. We also then took those 2 open-ended questions and completed cross-case analysis to look for commonalities and distinctions between the different groups. Now, when we talk about the first research question was about the micro-recommendation. The question asked, how likely are you to recommend this to a colleague from 1 to 10? And there was a significant difference in the ANOVA at a very significant rate. So we ran Tukey's HSD and found that first, we know that the intended was significantly higher than the unintended group of recommendation for version 1. But what's more startling is how much the version 2 impacted that growth as well, that recommendation. And interestingly, the unintended audience became the most likely to recommend this to a colleague. Now, it's not significantly different than the intended audience, but it was significantly higher than even the intended audience in the first version. So just by making iterations to make it more user-friendly, maybe easier to follow and understand the material, there was that ability for them to feel like they learned something and want to recommend this to other peers. Now, second question is, how many hours did it take you to complete this micro-credential? And it could go from clicking numbers 1 through 12 or a final button that said more than 12 hours. There was no significant difference in any of the groups, which is quite surprising when you think about the fact that from version 1 to version 2, we added a significant amount of material. And between the groups, they perceived it took them about 6.4 hours and a standard deviation of about 3.3 hours. So even when you think about the unintended not having as much knowledge in elementary mathematics, they still felt it took them about the same amount of time as those that are in that area. With perceived difficulty, again, there was no considered perceived difficulty more so than from one group to another, which is again surprising. You would think that the difficulty would be perceived a little bit higher by the unintended audience, but Either group they felt is about the same, which is just a little harder than what they expected, because 3 would be what they expected it to be. And then with perceived learning, again, the two groups from version 1 weren't that different in what they perceived learning, but there was a significant difference from version 2 to version 1, where both groups from version 2 are felt they learned significantly more than those from version 1. And so again, that idea that just the improvement of the material impacted both the intended and unintended audience positively. And it's unique that both groups had that positive influence, and it was both greater than even the intended audience from version 1. Within the cross-case analysis, there were some commonalities. First, there were many participants across all the different versions that felt the site was user-friendly. They enjoyed having the flexible pacing and the fact they could come in and out as they needed, so they enjoyed that asynchronous design, meeting them where they are and what they need. Within the content, there was continually comments about the material and how they enjoyed learning about it, especially Module 4, which focused on modifications and accommodations. And that's one that we believe what happened is that's material they could transfer into their own content, even if they weren't math teachers. That notion of what are accommodations and modifications and how can we utilize those in our classroom still could be utilized in other situations. As one participant from an unintended group said, there were many great ideas and strategies offered to help me meet my students' needs, even though their students weren't math students. Now, there were some distinctions. For example, only in version 1 was there talk about frustration with the functionality of the micro-credential. And when we talk about functionality, we're talking about those typos, the grammatical errors, questions that maybe had issues with them, as this participant noted, about how something was marked, they got it correct, but they received 0 points for it. Some of that was because it was multi-select and maybe they marked part of it right and another part incorrect. So trying to clear up some of that language, but also making sure everything was accurately marked. None of those comments showed up in version 2 by either of the participants. All of that completely disappeared, which may have actually helped with the overall learning experience, which is why we see some of those improvements even with the unintended audience. Also, we can look at some distinctions of comments made by the unintended audience members. In version 1, there were several comments talked about that this wasn't designed for teachers who do not teach math. This isn't for me. I shouldn't be taking this. Whereas in version 2, there were many unintended audience members that put things like this. The class was eye-opening. I learned something from this. I can take this back to my classroom. I never thought about the fact that the way we word things can have such an impact on how students learn. All these different comments that even though it wasn't their material, they could see the transference of the material back to their own situation. And we think part of that had to do, again, with that learning experience improvement. So when we look at this as a whole, we recognize that improvements and iterations can have a huge impact on all participants, especially those that were unintended, probably because it's helping make the material clear and more transparent and understandable. Interestingly, even when we added material and we think about an unintended audience versus an intended audience, there was no added time or stress even though these things occurred. So that's a positive aspect. Again, that's maybe just the usability became easier because there's these resources and supports to help make sense of some of the material. Also, we start to notice that even when it's not for the intent, they're not part of the intended audience, there was a transference of material, and that could be recognized as in this second iteration. And this leads us to considering, what do we do with future research in this area? Should we only be considering the intended audience, since that's who the professional development was made for? Or should we be considering, how do we reach this other group? How do we help them see the transference? Do we make additional ancillary information available, exercises that could be utilized, and explain how could you transfer this to a different area? Those are questions we're still trying to grasp, and also think about how can we continue to research in the future. So if this is something that interests you, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear some of your own experiences if you've had this same situation with intended and unintended audiences within your own professional development, and what you've noticed as well, and if you've done any research. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope to hear more from you.